Welcome, friends, to Beyond the Crucible, a podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate. It's so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today, and we're going to choose to accept it, our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those setbacks, and challenges, and failures that you've experienced or are experiencing right now, they don't define you. They refine you. They did not happen to you. They happened for you. And I don't know many people, probably don't know anybody really, who knows that better than the founder of Beyond the Crucible, the host of this show, and my friend Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, I think I can speak for you when I say this is one of the most exciting episodes that we've been part of, I think that's a fair statement, isn't it?
It's a fair statement, and it surely is.
And that is true. Because our guest this week, folks, is Leanna Fairfax. You heard me right. Last name Fairfax. You'll understand the connection as we get going. But Leanna has several experiences of homelessness and later went back to university. She discovered housing research through her BA in social policy and noticed a lack of representation of her experiences of homelessness within research. Leanna then completed an MA in social research at the University of Leeds. She's also an evidence and data associate at the Center for Homelessness Impact, as well as a member of a new lived experience group run by Shelter UK. Leanna's PhD is concerned with the gendered nature of housing, with a particular reference to the management of single mothers who are homeless. Translation of all that, folks, she's a whole heck of a lot smarter than I am. Warwick, take it away and speak to your relative.
Well, Leanna, it is such an honor to have you. When you reached out on LinkedIn and we started messaging back and forth, it was just sort of amazing that somehow we have this connection. So I'll let you, mention the connection in your own words, but just before we get into your backstory, just talk about how you came to find me on LinkedIn and why. I think there was a life event that happened that caused you to be curious about your own genealogy and background. So just talk about just some of those initial messages and how you reached out, why you reached out, and just some of that. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. How I found you, I'm not entirely sure. Actually, I just remember. I know it was through after my father died in April. I became a bit more curious. Well, I've always been curious about my dad's side of the family because I know Fairfax is not a common surname, and I've had a few comments over the years, just, oh, that's a very notable surname. And, from the postman delivering my mail. So I was like, always be like, oh, okay. And so when he passed away, it got me wondering. So I started to look a bit more on ancestry and look at the family history and the tree. And I came across the Fairfaxes from Warwickshire, and I found that we was related to them, so we like ancestor. They're my ancestors, should I say? And so then I just started to Google a bit more about the Fairfax family from Warwickshire, and I think it was Warwickshire.
Yeah,
correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, yeah, you got it.
Yeah. So I had a Google to see a bit more about that, and then it came across Fairfax Media, and I think it's John Fairfax who travelled to Australia. So I just found it really interesting that it was more that I related with him because of my own life experiences. And everyone's always asked me, how are you here? I've been to university before, and I've been in counselling sessions, and even the counsellor at the university were just like, wow, how are you at university? It's just, it's astounding, like what gets you through and keeps you going. And so I guess seeing his journey and his story of him travelling to Australia, I think with like the equivalent of £5 in his pocket or something, it just resonated with me. And then I started thinking, well, perhaps maybe it's in sort of my DNA. So then I had I think you popped up on the Google search when I was looking at Fairfax Media on LinkedIn. So I clicked on it to see more about you and what you do. And then I think it was on Wikipedia or somewhere it told me the history of how you was involved with Fairfax Media.
Oh, boy.
And then I was thinking, yeah. So then I was thinking, like, I can really see, like, even with you and with what happened with Fairfax Media whilst you was in control, I just still sort of resonated with that, and how you came back from that too. Again, I felt like it was something perhaps to do with, sort of genetics, and perhaps there's really such a thing as it being in your DNA, it'd be certain characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So when you reached out, and because you're in Leeds, which, for those not in the UK, is in the north of England, I thought, Leanna must be from the Yorkshire Fairfaxes rather than the Warwickshire. Now, it so happens, again, Leanna and I know a bit, but obviously most people won't know much about Fairfax family heritage. But the more famous branch, the more noble branch is the Yorkshire branch. There's like a Gilling Castle somewhere and up there, I forget whereabouts it is in Yorkshire, but there was a Lord Fairfax. They went to the US and owned much of Northern Virginia. There was a Lord Fairfax who was commander of the parliamentary forces in the English Civil War. Little esoteric fact. He wanted democracy, but Cromwell, who was under him, basically had his house surrounded and ended up killing the king, King Charles I, which, Lord Fairfax was like, I want democracy. I don't really want to kill a king. And then, that's not really what I'm about. All that's to say is there were the famous branch, the branch that, I come from, I found out Leanna comes from, is the Warwickshire branch, not as famous. So that when you said, well, my family originally from Warwickshire, it's like, that's crazy. And then you told me that John Fairfax, my great-great-grandfather, I think was like your third great-great-uncle. I mean, that just was amazing. But yeah, there is some perseverance. Obviously, I've read some about John Fairfax. In fact, there's a biography that somebody I know, Stuart Johnson, is working on that goes into more detail than is currently available. But just within the Warwickshire branch, there is this history of perseverance. So at one point in the 1700s, there was a Fairfax. It was like, I don't know, Lord Mayor of the town of Warwick or somewhere. Anyway, somehow he lost everything in gambling and drink and, made the whole family poverty stricken. So by the time John Fairfax came along, he had nothing. He was apprenticed to a printer, a book printer, and came out to Australia with nothing. The thing that really helped him get a start was at the end of this 4 to 6 month journey, sometimes they would do like a little prize of you stick your hand in a raffle and you'll get something. Well, it turns out he won the raffle and got like, I don't know if it was £5 or £10, which back in late 1830s, it must have been an enormous sum of money. So winning the raffle was actually helpful to him, the ship raffle. So weird set of circumstances. So yeah, and definitely the way he came back was pretty incredible. So yeah, and then before I get into your story, another thing that we spoke about, which was just so crazy. I have a daughter, I have 2 sons and a daughter, and my daughter's she works in, I guess you'd say child development in hospitals, just with kids who, parents are very ill. Anyway, at one point she worked for a faith-based organization in Australia, Mission Australia, and they work with families who are homeless, who don't have housing. And they sort of help come alongside these families. And the amazing thing is this Mission Australia, one of the founders of that was John Fairfax. In fact, every nonprofit that existed in Sydney, he pretty much founded or funded. It's like where he had the time, I don't know. So there's this other connection with your passion for helping the homeless, that's my daughter spent some time there and John Fairfax helped start it. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So I don't know. Anyway, so before we get to your backstory, what does all this make you think? Certainly for me, it's just, I just can't believe having an ancestor like that. It's almost intimidating. When you learn all of this, I mean, about your family, what does that make you feel and think? Because it's a pretty amazing story. John Fairfax alone and just the family in general. What does it make you think?
I think it just kind of gave me answers. I think, like I said, to some of the questions I'd even wondered myself, like, well, how did I keep going through the challenges that I've been faced with? And then also it gave me sort of a bit of motivation, a bit of like, oh gosh, I can't let the name down in some kind of way. Like I need to keep on with my work. Yeah, so I found it motivating as well.
That's wonderful. So let's talk a bit about your backstory growing up, and obviously I understand, Leanna, that, was not easy. So just help people understand how you grew up and just some of the challenges you had.
I've had quite a bit of homelessness experience. When I was 15, the relationship between me and my mother was quite strained for reasons between the separation of my mum and dad, basically. So there was a bit of hostility there towards my mum from me, which I hadn't really forgiven her for at that point. I was still young, so we used to argue a lot, and I ended up becoming not like homeless, but I didn't feel comfortable being there. So I was staying like at friends' houses, like, and trying to avoid going home. I never really felt like I had a place to stay. And I'd spoken to the council, and they'd said, like, here in the UK, that when you get to 16, we can help you find housing, but you just need to wait till you're 16. Otherwise, it would be the involvement of social services, which my mum didn't want, and I didn't really want ideally. So I just waited until I was 16, and then they offered me my first flat. But of course, being 16, I was quite vulnerable. I had a young child at the time as well. I ended up getting in like a abusive relationship, and it was a really volatile relationship. And eventually, after there, I moved to somewhere else because it was a bigger place for me and my children. And then I moved to where I am now, which is Leeds. Sorry, this was in York, so I've moved to Leeds. And I came over here to be closer to my partner, who was abusive. But I guess I didn't really have any connection with York. I didn't really feel like I ever had any connection, because that's where my mum was from. I wasn't originally born there. I was born in London, and York is quite a small place in comparison to London, obviously, and it's a lot less diverse, and so I never really felt like I fitted in. Whereas in Leeds, I did. It's not as big as London, but it's definitely more multicultural. There's a lot more going on. So I felt more at home here, which is why I chose to move here. And then, unfortunately, a few times in Leeds, I ended up homeless, often as a result through domestic abuse. And yeah, I've forgotten what else you asked me. I've just kind of gone off on a tangent.
No. Good. So how old were you when your parents separated, and what was life like before the separation for you? I mean, how old were you?
I was 5.
Oh my gosh.
But my life was a lot different before the separation, because my dad, it was quite ironic, because even though this would have been the 80s, so it still wouldn't have been quite as popular as what it is now, but my dad was the stay-at-home, so he was a stay-at-home father. He looked after us whilst my mum went to university, while she did her degree and stuff, and then went on to work in the civil service. So he was looking after us at home whilst my mum was out. So obviously when they split, there was quite a big change, because my dad was no longer there. And of course he lived in London, I lived in York. And it was the way in which they split as well, because my mum never explained it to us. She just sort of took us away and never explained that to us. So, of course, I was angry from a very young age. Like, where's my dad gone? Where's everything gone? And like I said, York and London are like the polar opposites of each other. So it was predominantly white, very quiet. And coming from London, even at such a young age, you really see those changes. It's just you wouldn't think that you would, but you do, and you just feel a shift in, I think, the energy.
Yeah. So, do you have siblings?
I've got one with who's like with my mum and dad, and then
Sure.
my dad had 6 other children from a previous relationship.
Okay.
So yeah, I've got 7 altogether.
Got it. Yeah, no, I get it. My dad was married 3 times. My mother twice. Fortunately, I was from the last marriage of each, so I get complex families. So you mentioned anger. I mean, obviously, when parents separate, obviously life was pretty challenging after that. So talk about what you were feeling. I mean, you were angry. I mean, just talk about some of those feelings, and just the experiences, which probably led to some, greater challenges.
I think it was just a bit like a lot of anger, really, and confusion of just what was happening, and I couldn't understand why my mum had become so hostile with my dad. Because obviously I was young, I didn't even understand. We got told we was going on a holiday to my grandma's, so that's what we thought was happening, and then we never returned back. And my dad had to, God bless him, he fought, so he was going constantly from London up to York to fight to get access to us, and he never gave up. So, and in the end, he did win that access, and in the end, he did get full access in terms of we can go stay there and everything. But of course, when I was little, I didn't see this picture, so I didn't understand what was going on. So I just felt, just really angry towards my mum and confusion. And when I did finally get in contact with my dad, when he got in contact with us, and he was getting access to us, and when we started to go visit him, that's when things started to make more sense, because he was talking about it more, whereas my mum didn't. She didn't speak about any of what had gone on, whereas my dad did explain, your mum said she was going on holiday, she didn't come back, so obviously I went to the courts and things, and by this time I was about 8, I think it was. So I started to understand it a bit more, but I still felt, I just felt so angry. It felt so much wasted years, because eventually my mum did end up talking to him. Eventually she did accept his help, because it wasn't like he wasn't wanting to help, if that makes sense. And eventually she did, and then it was like nothing had ever happened, because in the end, when he was on his final days, my mum was caring for him. So it's how often does that happen? Because often when people split up, but that's testimony to my dad's character as a person. That's just how he was. He never held no hatred towards my mum. He would never say a bad word about my mum, and he wouldn't let me do that either, despite everything that could have given reason to do so. And I think that because he persevered like that, and he didn't hold anger towards her, that's why in the end my mum kind of felt compelled to sort of to help him, because he wanted to be closer to his children and his grandchildren, and his younger children. So that's why he ended up here when he was ill, and they ended up taking his final breath in her home.
I mean, that's astounding. I mean, do you look back now that you're a PhD candidate, you understand families and divorce and all that better? Do you look back and say, this was so unnecessary? People get divorced, but it didn't have to be so hostile. If they hadn't gone through such a hostile split, maybe my life would have been better, and I wouldn't have been, I don't know, put words in your mouth. Maybe you wrote it somewhere, set up to fail. Do you look back and say, this was unnecessary? It didn't need to happen. I didn't need to go through what I went through. It just was so unnecessary. Sometimes dads are abusive and awful, but it doesn't sound like you had this abusive, awful dad. Do you look back on it and say, this whole thing was so unnecessary, and what I went through was unfair and unnecessary?
Yeah, I do. But I do also know that I think my mum thinks the same, because when she was in London, she had a really good job, and she often speaks about if I hadn't have left, I would have been retired by now and on a good pension. So I'm sure that she thinks about these things too. But Yeah, I do. I do think about that, and I do wonder, like, oh, I wonder how my life would have been different, how things would have been. But then at the same time, I don't like to get too caught up in them sort of thoughts, because then you start, you forget why you're here now, and perhaps I wouldn't have gone to university. Perhaps I wouldn't have had the same drive or determination to do what I'm doing now. Um, so in a sense, it's all part of my journey. I don't really like to think back too much like that.
As you look back on that, what do you reflect on those relationships? And do you feel like you were almost set up to fail even there, that, people took advantage of you? Or how do you look at that, the whole abusive relationship side?
I think at one point in time, before I started university and started sort of my academic journey, at one point in time, I sort of self-internalized that. So I would blame myself, like it was my failings. I was too soft, I was too weak, but as I've gone down my academic sort of journey, it's become more apparent to me that there's sort of circumstances that make not just me but other women more vulnerable. So for example, if you've grew up in poverty, if you've witnessed domestic abuse, or whether you haven't had good role models as for relationships for your parents, and of course homelessness is a massive contributing factor into that, because a lot of the time you're looking for security, and you feel quite vulnerable in that state. Like you feel like, oh well, no one would want me. I'm here. I've got no house. I've got children, and having someone who shows you affection, then when you're in that mind state, you don't necessarily question why they're showing you that affection, and and it can work both sides, because obviously I'm not sympathizing with the abuser at all, but sometimes they haven't had a great upbringing, they don't have stability, they don't have a home, so they're also looking for a home. And when a woman's got kids and they've got a home, it's kind of, and they're it's not a good match. And that's why I think that when I look back on my situations, it makes sense to me now how I ended up in those situations, and without that, within that, I didn't have much power, because I didn't have much choice at that moment in time, in terms of like, I didn't have much financial freedom. I didn't really have much choice in where I was living or who I was with, them sort of things. So.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't have too many options. There can be a sense, as you say, hey, maybe this is, my fault in some sense, or lack of feeling of worth. I mentioned before, what my daughter does with Child Life. She mentions she works with children of adult patients. She's had kids say, the reason mom or dad is sick is it's my fault. And that's not uncommon. It makes no sense, but that's the psychology. It's like, oh, if I'd done my homework, I think one example, she said, if I cleaned my room up, my mom wouldn't have been sick. So, it's just amazing the strange stuff that people internalize, right? Somehow when it's not your fault at all, somehow it's, why would anybody love me, or that kind of notion, or so.
Yeah, because I think that because the problem's so big and wide, you don't really necessarily connect the two together. So it's like you don't look at the bigger picture. You're trying to justify it in that all So you're trying to make sense of it, and as a natural human response is to do that, to make sense of it. Because if you don't make sense of it, it's really hard to digest. So, unless you've actually explored the wider picture and understand it, and especially children, that they're not able to do so, they're too young to do that. So it's very common to internalize those feelings, and then that just continues as you grow up.
So let's talk about how you kind of turned the corner, because you've been homeless, you've lived in hostels, you've been abused. I mean, you've had a very tough upbringing, and a lot of people in that would find it difficult to get out. And I think you've said before, some people look at how your journey has gone and said, well, Leanna, I don't know if they said it's a miracle, or how is it possible? And so just talk about how life changed for you. How did it change, and kind of why did it change?
I think it was more emotionally that it changed and sort of mentally. So it's like I said, it's making sense of the situations of what I'd experienced in the past and what I had self-internalized, and then uninternalizing them through my learning journey. Because then it was like, oh, hold on a minute, like, just because I was born in poverty doesn't mean that that was my fault. Yeah, society makes me feel that way. It makes me feel like I'm worthless because I was poor or because I had children young. And then you start to realize actually, no, that belief that you had is not true. So it was continuously challenging my own beliefs of myself, and just growing as a person, I think, like mentally. Although it's really difficult because even now still you do always still think like, I don't know, maybe it's because you're sort of scarred from your previous trauma. You do always think like, oh, it's just one mistake away from that situation. And again, if you know what I mean, it's like, so you're always like cautious of it and aware of it. And sometimes you do question yourself like, oh, has so much changed? Has it really changed? And then it can be really difficult actually. Actually, I've got 2 degrees. Like, it doesn't matter what happens. I've always got those degrees, and I'm doing my PhD. I'll have a 3rd degree, and even if my journey in academia doesn't work out, or in that, I've still got these degrees. I can use the transferable skills that can go. You forget this. It's like because. Yeah, I think because you're traumatized from the trauma that's happened in the past, and sometimes you have to continuously self-remind yourself, like,
And you talk about those 2 degrees, and it's interesting because when we talked prior to our recording here, the pivotal thing that led you there, you said you decided to go back to university, and you're like, you told me, I don't know why I decided that. Like that came upon you. You weren't mulling it over for a long time. What was it as you've thought back over it? Do you realize now what it was that led you to go, I'm going to continue my education? What led you to believe that was a path you wanted to take?
It's not even continue, it was start. I never had GCSEs. I left school. I left school when I was 14. So, I mean, for me, it was starting education. I had no idea of what an essay would be like. I had no idea at all about anything at university. And I have no idea still what made me. I just felt like I wanted something better. I wanted something more. And I couldn't specifically say what that was, and I still couldn't now. It was just I had this desire in me to want better, and I think a part of it was wanting an office job that fit in school hours, and one way of doing that was to get a degree. So it was just kind of like I was just thinking of that moment of when I get that degree, then I can go into an office job, and I'll just sort of wing it. That's what I thought. Which of course never happened. I've worked at like office, but it was work from home, so I never actually went in. But I was thinking more of my sights were set up sort of like as a admin assistant or something like that. Like I wasn't thinking like, oh yeah, I want to be a manager, or not at that moment in time. My ceiling was, well, through university you learn, like through what I've studied, like the thing is, when you grow up in poverty, your sort of ceiling is a lot lower than, say, somebody who's grew up with, financial, good financial access and with wealth. So, the ceilings are not comparable. So obviously at that moment in time, my ceiling was there. It's only through exposure and experience of meeting other people. I think most importantly was the meeting other lecturers at the university who had working class backgrounds, who had sort of had similar sort of adversities and trauma, and yet they had got to that position. It was kind of like, oh wow, like if you can do it, I can do it, which is why representation, I'm going off, but representation is really important within anywhere, with any workforce.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that, seems to happen is when you make one small step, I'd like my life to be a little different. Maybe I could get an office job. So if I get some education, I can have an office job and then I'll be available for my kids at the end of the day. That felt like a reasonable goal at the time, right? Even if it's being an executive assistant. Well, once you make that small step, then, maybe there's another step that's kind of beyond that, one small step leads to another. You weren't thinking at the time, gee, I left school at 14, maybe I could get a PhD. Obviously, it would have been like, there is no way. I mean, but one step leads to another step. But often I find the decision to make that first step, okay, I'm going to go back to school so I can get an office job. Did that feel like a big decision at the time?
Oh, massive. I remember getting my interview for the undergraduate degree, and Richard, who was the module leader, who was in charge of it and run it, he interviewed me. And I just remember when I got onto the university campus, I was just like, oh my God, I do not belong here. What am I doing here? So many voices were telling me, just go home, it's fine, doesn't matter, you don't need to do it. But then at the back of my head, I just pushed myself to do it. And when I went to the interview, I was so nervous. But now, after speaking to Richard after I graduated, he said to me, when he seen me, you just saw something in me. So he was hoping, because I didn't have GCSE, so I had to do a maths and English test there. And I was thinking to myself, I'll definitely fail. I will definitely fail my maths. And I didn't have no faith, but I still did it, and I passed. I was like, what? When he told me I passed, apart from one comment he commented on when I was writing in my English, because you had to write a story or something. I can't really remember now, but apparently I'll write something about myself. But I kept writing I, and of course in academia you never write I know that now. I was just I did this and I did that. It's you say a lot of I's. So yeah.
I mean, just to give folks in the US and other places an idea, what Leanna's saying is she hadn't finished high school. Imagine trying to go to university when, you haven't done your junior, senior year in high school. You got to make that up. You got to do your high school equivalents or what have you. That's not an easy thing to do. It's not like, oh yeah, no problem. You got to have that before a university will let you in. I mean, it's just astounding that you did that. And not only, and you got a BA in social policy at University of Leeds, you got a first class degree. I mean, that's the highest grade you can get. That's A+ or something in US. I mean, that's just not skating through. And then you got a master's degree, I think also, wasn't it from University of Leeds, in social research, which is kind of amazing. And now you're at Sheffield Hallam. And so talk about that. You're PhD candidate there. So talk about what that is.
So when I was originally going to do my PhD at Leeds, but the funding, I wasn't awarded the funding, so I'd have to self-fund. And I was going to do that because my supervisor that I had at Leeds was amazing, Andrew. He was great, and he's well respected within the field. And I was like, I don't know what to do. But then an offer came up for Sheffield Hallam with my supervisor, who is now Kezia. And I'd met her a few times. I've worked with her on a few different sort of podcasts and different projects, because she specialises in women's homelessness and gender. So we crossed paths a few times. I was like, and it was funded. So I was like, I'll give it a shot and I'll apply. And then I had to write this research proposal. I had the interview, and then they told me that I'd passed and that I was to be awarded. But there was there was another good candidate, so we both won. And then since then, I've just been sort of doing a lot of reading and research on women's homelessness and exploring ways in which I want my research to go, really, and how I wish to conduct it.
What was the impetus for you wanting to focus on research? A lot of times when we've been through Crucible experiences and we want to come back and sort of help in the same area that we had at Crucible, people want to start a nonprofit, people want to start a business. You wanted to research things that help people start nonprofits, help nonprofits operate. And before you answer that question, let me say, I can tell that you and Warwick are related because Warwick loves research too. Warwick, this is something that folks who listen to this show and watch the show don't know. When we have a guest on who's written a book, this is no joke, folks. Warwick will print up to 85 pages of items from their book so that we're asking informed questions. So you should know, Leanna, you and Warwick have that in common, that love of research. But why did you pick research as sort of your focus rather than something else? What was it about it that intrigued you, that made you think this is where I want to make my difference?
So it's interesting you asked that, actually, because when I finished my master's degree, my undergraduate degree, I originally went off for a little bit and did like housing office work, which would have been working directly on the front line, helping to support people who were homeless. But I was always cautious about doing this because I didn't want to become a part of the problem. And in that, I say that obviously when you're on the front line, or you're, working as an advisor, or going onto the streets and helping them, you are always bound by the sort of bureaucracy of the system. So there's only so much help you can do, and whether people fit in that criteria or not. And I would have felt quite infuriated at having to sort of just be like, well, I'm sorry, that's just the way it is, and I can't do anything further. And I think that would have drove me a bit more mental than doing actual research. And from the experience that I got when I was working as the housing officer, I really felt like this wasn't like, people were not treated as human. They was treated as sort of a number. And I didn't feel that fitted my my morals and my, and how I envisioned helping people. And yes, I can come in there and help as much as I can, but I just would have been feeling left more saddened that I can't help more. And that's when I decided that actually I want to continue in academia. I want to just further my journey in there, because I feel that when you're doing your research, there is no right or wrong answer. And you can challenge things a bit more. There's an element of challenge in there. Like, you could say to someone like, I don't necessarily agree with what you are saying because of X, Y, and Z. Of course, you've always got to use your evidence. So I've got stuff for 2 seconds. So being able to have that, I'm trying to think of the word. My mind's gone blank. Sort of like autonomy. That's it. Autonomy. Having autonomy of your own time, of your own mind, of your own thoughts. That's what I wanted. I didn't want to be politicalized by saying that you shouldn't support this, or you can't really speak out when you're working for the local government, for example. Like, I support this and I'm really against that. You're not able to do that. But in academia, you are. You might be seen as controversial, but no one could say, shut up. You're sat if they wouldn't say that.
So it sounds like you felt like in the academic world, you could make more of a difference, so that people like you years ago, that you can help folks who are homeless. You talked about a number of the challenges there, whether it's, men and women, mixed housing, and the opportunities for abuse or just unhelpful dynamics. And sometimes I think you mentioned that the people who work there maybe don't receive the proper training and aren't always as welcome as they could be. I mean, you state a number of those challenges. So talk about why that's so important to you, and just what you're working on with your PhD and the difference you're hoping to make in the system or the way of thinking.
Well, I think that it's really important. I spoke with this earlier about representation, and having people who have lived experience of what they're working within. I really think that you bring a different dynamic to the workforce, and different challenges. And sometimes you see things that somebody without the lived experience doesn't see. And you can just help, connect the dots of certain situations, or understanding of the reasons why people are in such situations, or even under critical analysis of understanding of how best we can try resolve this situation. And I really do believe that without that lived experience, not without it, but with lived experience added into that mix, you are better able to resolve or come up with solutions. And I think that could apply to any workplace, to be honest with you, because when you've got that experience, it really helps understand, problems that arise. My mind's gone blank.
I don't know. Well, good. But I think it also gives you a degree of empathy. You're not judging these women and say, you should have got a job, or how come you got in this abusive relationship? Don't you have any self-respect? I mean, there's a whole meme of negative judgmental responses as somebody that hasn't grown up that way, whereas you would have a sense of compassion. So people with lived experience are going to have more compassion, more understanding. And frankly, because since your work is about women who are homeless, the other women might feel like, okay, I think I can trust this person. This person gets it. They're not judging me. They're not saying, oh, it's all your fault. Get a grip, pull yourself up. Come on, stop complaining, get at it. I mean, people can be very judgmental and nasty, frankly, but with that lived experience, it gives you some empathy and compassion, and maybe, as you say, some thoughts about how to help. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. There is an element of that too, and I've definitely experienced that judgment when I was homeless. But I've also had people make those types of comments to me within a professional setting, and you just kind of like, and knowing that they know that I've had that experience, so it just goes to show how ingrained these judgments can be. And I don't necessarily think that they're aware of making these judgments.
As you kind of look back on this, has there been any sense of like healing and understanding of what you've been through? And as you looked at it, and maybe, it's easy to be hard on ourselves. I mean, a lot of us are, rather than blaming everybody else, there's a tendency for some of us. I mean, I'm certainly that way, of blaming myself. But as you look back, has this enabled you to have more understanding, maybe being impressed with your journey, or what's your education helped you with as you reflect back on your past experience for you personally?
I think it just gave me understanding of situations and how I might have ended up there, and a lot less easier on myself, not being as judgmental. And certainly if anyone was to judge me, those judgments do not affect me like how they would have done in the past. I would have internalized them, I would have felt them, I would have felt an interaction. But now I quite enjoy the fact that sometimes people might look at me and judge me, but then when I'm like, oh, I'm doing a PhD, it's like, what? Like, you're doing a PhD, you don't look like you're doing a PhD, because I don't necessarily dress or act like I'm doing a PhD. And I'm not in that circle, so I do enjoy sometimes sort of renewing that. But it's definitely, I think it's just made me a lot more kinder to myself. I think my academic journey has, and also made me more passionate, and not even passionate just in the sense of like helping others understand this on a more higher level, but even just on a normal sort of everyday level. I see things in other people who might not necessarily see that in themselves. So like when they're able to advocate for themselves, or that like, I can never do university, they make statements like that. But really, you can see the qualities there. They just think that they can't do university because perhaps that's what they've been taught, at school. Like, oh, you're just, you can't behave, you'll never achieve anything, and all these sort of negative affirmations that they then internalize, and they grew up and always thought that. And I can see certain qualities in others, and I try like sort of coax that out of them, like, oh, but you're doing that right. Like that takes a lot of management skills, so sort of to help them understand, and that what they're capable of too.
I mean, often it takes just one person to see something positive that can change the course of their life. And, maybe you had one or two, but certainly maybe not, but you can be the advocate that maybe you wished you'd have, or somebody that says to somebody else, no, you're not worthless. It's not all your fault. It's complicated, the system, there's a lot of dysfunction out there in families in the world, but, you don't have to be defined by it. You can move ahead. You can have a positive impact. I mean, you're obviously passionate about what you do because you're helping people like yourself. And, it's a sacred cause. It's a mission. People need people like you to fight for them, to advocate for them, to trust them, to believe in them. And so, it's making an enormous difference in people's lives. One of the things that you said previously, I think is pretty amazing. I believe you said something like this: I'm thankful for my bad experiences because I wouldn't be who I am without them or have the motivation for my work. I've always believed that God doesn't do things without a reason. Explain that, because some people might say, thankful for bad experiences, somehow there's some higher power that's allowing this to happen. I mean, talk about what your feelings are on that and what you meant by that.
So it's quite controversial, I know, that topic of, I'm thankful. But in my understanding of the situation, without those bad experiences, I wouldn't have the awareness and understanding to, of others in that situation, for example. And I wouldn't have the drive and the determination of what I got from that. And I know that not everybody gets drive, determination, but it's the way in which I believe you get from the. I don't want to make people feel like that it's their problem. So I'm trying to construct it. It's the way in which you process those emotions through those situations that inevitably give you the access to what you gain from that. Does that make sense? I don't even know if that does that make sense?
It does. I mean, we've had a lot of people, maybe everybody on this podcast, perhaps, who've gone through traumas and bad experiences, whether it's losing loved ones or abuse, all sorts of, and there's this sense of compassion and drive to help others either avoid what they went through or help them bounce back. In some cases, it's not your fault. Some cases, it is your fault. I mean, every trauma and crucible is different. But whether it's forgive others or forgive yourself, pretty much everybody we've had have felt like, after about the 20th time, I had to really grapple with this concept. I heard people say, what I went through, was a gift. I don't think that's crazy, because pretty much every guest, and we've had every guest from every kind of trauma. Again, you're a researcher at a level that I'm not, but at least in terms of, we've done quantitative and qualitative research, but certainly in terms of qualitative research, the data is reasonably clear from our little window that, people who try to make sense of what they've been through, and they want to have a passion to help others. It just leads them on a path to positivity. And I'm rambling a bit, but I think what I'm trying to say is you're not the only person that's felt this way. Others have felt that way. They want to use what they've been through to make a difference. And imagine if you had this perfect upbringing with two parents that loved each other and didn't divorce. You could have still written on homelessness, but your knowledge and advocacy, it wouldn't have been what it is. Nobody would wish on you what you went through, but how could you have written what you've written without your experience? It would have been impossible, right? That question makes any degree of sense,
Yeah, exactly. I think that's always mindful, but also I always think of it like it's kind of like God saved me from a worse situation, because you can sit there and think like, oh, if this had happened, I would be like this. But you don't know that. You don't know what the situation would have been had that have stayed. You don't know how things would have turned out, and it could quite possibly have been even worse. And that's me speaking from my experiences. And even some people are like, wow, you really went through all that? And it's like, yeah, I did. But I do believe that, I can't say for sure whether anything would have been. I remember one time actually in a therapy session with a counsellor, and they said to me like, oh, imagine if you hadn't have had the experiences that you had, like, imagine how high of a degree, like, how good, you could have done with your degree, like, or something like that. Or you could have even done even better. And I was just kind of like, but how do I know that? I don't know that, do I? And it's just a bit of a wasted sport.
No offense, that seems like not a good question for a therapist to ask. I mean, it was designed to make you feel bad. It's like, wow.
Yeah,
sorry to be judgmental, but it's like, come on, really?
And that's what I thought after. I was a bit bemused. I was a bit like, why would I think that? Because, it could have been, but then it could have been worse. I might not have even ever got to university. Like, there's certain things, for example, that's happened to me when I was homeless the last time. I'd moved down to my dad's in London, and we was trying to find housing there, but it was just so expensive. And then in the end, I decided to come back to Leeds. And because the whole reason why I left in the first place was because of the ex that I originally spoke about when I was younger. But I had no other choice. And that's it. In UK, you have to go back to where you've got a local connection. So this was my last local connection. So I had to come back here. And at the time, I just remember thinking like, oh, why? And even now, sometimes I look back and I'm like, oh, I really wish I just maybe persevered a bit more in London. I wish I'd stuck it a bit more, because I really love London. That's my home. But then I think to myself, would I have gone to university? I might not have gone to university. I might not have done the university. Because when I was over there, I was looking at university. I was looking at just like nursing. I just had no clue. I was just looking at any degree course. I said, I'll do nursing. That sounds good. But when I came up here, I stumbled across this social policy, and not every university, I should have said this earlier on actually, but the degree that I got on was like a foundation degree, and they create them specifically for people from, from poor areas and with certain characteristics, like no qualifications, no family history of qualifications, things like that. That's how I got through the degree. And not every university has that option. So I might not have got, into university even in London. So coming here, it opened up a hell of a lot of doors that perhaps wouldn't have opened up had I have stayed in London, And even now, so like I said, for mine's a tempting thing, you can go back and think, if I stayed in London, it could have been good. It could have had more opportunities, because obviously in my line of work, there is a lot more choice down there. But, then again, I might not have had that degree. I might not have got these, might not be doing what I'm doing now.
That sound you heard, folks, is the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating it's time for our initial descent to land in honor of both the host and the guest, who speak with an accent far cooler than mine from Wisconsin. It's about time to land the aeroplane, but not yet.
Okay.
We're not going to land yet. Warwick's going to have a couple more questions, maybe at least one. So Warwick, I turn it back over to you to get the wheels on the ground.
So Leanna, I mean, it really is an honor to hear your story, your journey. It's inspiring. I mean, there aren't too many people that have gone through what you've been through that have found a way out, let alone, get a first-class honors degree at undergrad, a master's, and a PhD candidate. I mean, it's just, it's almost inconceivable. I mean, it's you obviously must have a lot of perseverance, and we talk a lot about not being defined by your worst day. Well, you're not being defined by your worst years. It was more than just one day, I'm afraid, but it is so inspiring. I guess that may be a couple of questions, one would be a couple of questions. There might be somebody today who's maybe today is feel like their worst day, or they feel like there's no hope. Nobody could care about me. I'm not sure that I care about me. Why bother? What's the point?
I think I reflect upon myself. So it might just be like, why do I feel like this? Why am I having these thoughts? Where are they stemming from? That is really important, because more often than not, it stems from other people's thoughts and interactions with you. You believe that I'm no good at this. And when you look back and think to yourself, why am I no good at this? For example, for me, when I went to university and I started university, I used to think I could never do education. I was like, oh, I'll be hopeless at this. Because when I look back at it, when I was at school, people told me, teachers, that you'll never be good enough. You'll never be able to do that because you just can't apply yourself correctly. You can't listen correctly. And then you self-internalize them and you actually believe that. And when you reflect upon those feelings and you realize where they're stemming from, you're able to process them and see the reality a bit more better. It's like, I'm trying to think of like sort of a terminology for it now. It's like real, but when you're in those thoughts, you are kind of like clouded your judgment by these thoughts and you can't see past them. But when you start to self-reflect and think about where them feelings are coming from, you're kind of like opening the curtain slightly a little bit so that you can see a bit more clearer. And actually, I'm not a hopeless person. I'm not a worthless person because of X, Y, Z, and think about the more positive experiences. And even just like referring back to what you said earlier about having people who perhaps just had one sort of like even just one conversation in your life and that changed things. For me, I like sort of see it as like little seeds. So it's planting the seed within others. And there's definitely smaller interactions that I've had in my life that I can go back to and reflect upon. And when I am in those moments where I'm feeling hopeless, worthless, I reflect back upon those little seeds and they help me keep going. So yeah, that's another advice, to look back on and reflect upon the more positive interactions you've had and how they really changed your thoughts and feelings in that moment.
Yeah, excellent point, Leanna. I mean, a couple of maybe closing reflections. Yeah, you're right. Reflecting on maybe some of the positive things, maybe some of the things you have accomplished, which has been amazing. Having, even if it's just one or two friends, even if it's one, somebody that believes in you, that loves you unconditionally, that is helpful. Not always easy to find. A lot easier to find people that put you down, unfortunately, in some sense. At least for me, just a belief in a higher power. At least for me, my faith has always been helpful. That maybe there's a plan there, and at least I believe that somebody up there loves us unconditionally. That's always helped me. So whatever faith paradigm or belief paradigm, as I call it, having an anchor for your soul. I think everybody has to process it in their own way is helpful, but. Yeah, it just, I often think it's a little bit like exercise, diet and exercise. You could say, okay, so I exercised a year ago. I don't have to exercise again, do I? I'm good, right? No, every day it's a battle, because you want to be healthy. Well, the same with our souls and that self-talk. When I feel down or about something, or I'll read something, somebody died, some Fairfax media executive died the other day, a few weeks ago, I should say. And somewhere in there, it talked about, whenever they talk about me, it's like, and Warwick Fairfax and the disastrous takeover of the 150. It's always Warwick Fairfax and disastrous. Pretty much always. It's like, seriously? Really? Come on. This is like 30 years ago. Can you just let it go? I mean, yeah, I made a big mistake, but not like everybody lost their jobs. I mean, the company continued. But that was a bit of a downer, because nobody likes to see the word, your name and disaster, right? So it's like, okay, I'm not going to let this, it's going to get me down for a period, but I won't let that emotion define me. I'm not perfect, but I've accomplished some things. I have a wife I've been married to for, 35 years and blessed. So, I guess if you get my drift, that, you have days, somebody says something, you have a memory, and boom, it's like an arrow to the heart. It's like, okay, that's painful. I recognize it, but I will not be defined by that memory or that emotion. And you battle with it, with your reason, your faith, your emotions. So does that make any degree of sense? But it's sort of like a daily warfare, not being conquered by these feelings. That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. I was just even thinking about them when you was talking about my mind's gone blank again, but I was just thinking about when my father died, the positives in the situation. So reflecting upon, when you're in those darkest days, when you're in those moments where you are feeling like, how am I going to go on? Because my dad was a massive support within my life, throughout my life. He's always been there, even in the moments when I was homeless, because my dad didn't have a lot of money, but one thing he always did have was time. And time is invaluable, because that's something I will always remember. My dad took me everywhere on holidays. When I was in the abusive relationship, he used to like beg me all the time to leave. And when I did find, he'd open his doors, come down, I'll take you away, take you and the kids away. And he treated the kids like his own. So that's one thing he always did. So of course, when he did die, it was like a massive loss within my life. And it was kind of like, oh gosh, how am I going to deal with these situations now if I do get any problems? Like, I don't have my dad there, not even just for a phone call. But one thing that, in terms of like looking at the situation and taking the positives for me, was that I looked at it, obviously after I've been about 2 weeks of crying, and then realised, like, I need to get myself together. I can't sit here and just keep crying. I need to understand, like, my dad wouldn't have wanted this. My dad would have wanted me to be happy. And so then I started to think about the positives of the situation. And there was many positives in the fact that my dad got to die where he wanted to die. And he wanted to die at home. And he even got to the very stage when he was in his last sort of hours of death. And he made my mum move the tree, the photo. He wanted everything just in this position. And then he got into his position and was just very comfortable. And then we all got to say goodbye. Like, and not many people get that opportunity. So I was really, really thankful that I got to actually see my dad, to say goodbye, to get them last words off my chest, to say thank you for everything. So there was all these things that I could gather from that negative experience, but also take forward. And also it taught me, because I used to always be quite fearful of death. And I used to always actually say, when I die, I want to have a really quick death. I'd like just go. And I don't want to like have this prolonged sort of, you just die a moment and next you're gone. That's what I thought would be easiest. But actually, upon reflection, I'm like, easiest for who? Because for me, that might be easy. But would it be easy for my loved ones? It's the thought that, yeah. And I think now it's actually made me not scared of death. And I feel like actually the way in which my dad went was kind of really perfect, in the sense if you could plan it, that's how you'd want it. You've got your loved ones by your side, you're at home, you're surrounded by the love, and everything you've worked hard for throughout your life is there. And so, yeah, the darkest moments can also teach you and help you to conquer your fears. So, yeah.
Folks, I've been in the communications business long enough to know when the last word on a subject has been spoken. And this is very cool for me to say what I'm about to say, because normally I say the guest has said it. A couple times I've said Warwick has said it, but I get to say this time, the last word on this subject has been spoken by the Fairfaxes, because both Leanna and Warwick brought some great perspective to our conversation here today. Until our next time together, folks, please remember that we do know that your crucible experiences are difficult. Leanna and Warwick both talked about their own crucibles and how difficult they were. But look at them, listen to them. They've moved beyond those crucibles, and they are living a life of significance. And that can be your journey as well. If you learn the lessons of your crucibles, if you apply those lessons to your life moving forward, you too can arrive at a life of significance. Welcome to a journey of transformation with the Beyond the Crucible assessment. Unlike any other, this tool is designed to guide you from adversity to achievement. As you answer a few insightful questions, you won't just find a label like the helper or the individualist. Instead, you'll uncover your unique position in the journey of resilience. This assessment reveals where you stand today, the direction you should aim for, and crucially, the steps to get there. It's more than an assessment. It's a roadmap to a life of significance. Ready? Visit beyondthecrucible.com. Take the free assessment and start charting your course to a life of significance today.